Hello everyone, welcome to Decode Crime Files. Friends who fly themselves often, especially those who started flying commercial planes in the late 1990s to early 2000s, may have heard a term like this. It's called the 410 Club. At first it sounds like some kind of civilian group, but it's actually industry slang commercial pilots use to tease each other, show off, and feel self-satisfied. It generally refers to pilots who have flown a plane up to 41,000 feet, or 12,500 meters. That's because although the theoretical maximum altitude for aircraft like the Boeing and Airbus jets people usually fly, along with some small planes used for short-haul passenger runs, is set at 41,000 feet. Climbing that high usually wastes a huge amount of fuel, overheats and wears down the engines, and requires the plane to be empty of passengers. Those are the preconditions. So in reality, not many pilots actually get to fly at that altitude. Pilots who manage it through some stroke of luck often quickly become a topic of conversation within their small circles. Achieving this so-called accomplishment gradually became an obsession for pilots with a bit more vanity. And on a day in 2004, when two pilots realized the conditions to pull this off were finally in place, they could no longer hold back their desire to try. It was the night of October 14, 2004. A small regional jet, tail number 3701, belonging to Pinnacle Airlines, was flying an empty repositioning flight over the state of Missouri that night. In the cockpit was the 31-year-old Captain Jesse Rhodes, with the 24-year-old First Officer Peter Cesars beside him. On paper, the captain had close to 6,900 total flight hours, and the First Officer had 4,610. Both looked like experienced pilots. But dig a little deeper, and you'd find their experience was actually quite watered down. Because most of their so-called flight experience came from small propeller planes with very limited speed and altitude. For the Bombardier CRJ-200 jet they were now flying, the two of them had only about 900 plus and 200 plus hours respectively. And Jesse's total time independently commanding this aircraft as captain was only 150 hours. So they were still very much in a break-in period. That night their assignment was to fly the empty plane, with no passengers aboard, to another airport hundreds of kilometers away to prepare for the next day's passenger service. Even though it could only carry 50 passengers, the CRJ-200 was still a genuine jet, more than capable in terms of performance. Once they realized there were no passengers to worry about and the whole plane was entirely under their control, Jesse and Peter clearly got carried away, because wasn't this the perfect chance to join the so-called 410 Club? So after takeoff, they first put the plane through a few sharp climbs and rolls, then radioed ground control to say they wanted to climb to 41,000 feet. Once they got approval, they were thrilled and immediately entered the command into the plane's computer. Then the nose lifted, and the plane started climbing toward its maximum altitude. Looking back, whether it was to test their skills or feed their vanity, the decision to climb to 41,000 feet wasn't technically wrong. It was within the legal altitude range, and they had the authority to do it. The problem was they wanted this achievement too badly. So what should have been a gradual, staged climb turned into the crudest command possible: pitch the nose up, add full power, and shoot straight up. That was the start of the disaster. Because when the nose pitches up, it does generate a lot of lift and gain altitude fast, but drag increases too, so the plane's speed starts dropping even as its altitude climbs. And to make up for the lift lost from the drop in speed, the plane's computer, trying to carry out the rapid climb command it had been given, could only pitch the nose up even further, which made the plane slower still. That created a vicious cycle, and just like that, as the engines roared and barely pushed the plane up to 41,000 feet, the plane's speed had already dropped to the edge of a stall. At this point, an experienced veteran pilot, relying on years of muscle memory, would have sensed the danger immediately and corrected course. But Jesse and Peter were completely caught up in the satisfaction and excitement of reaching the plane's max altitude. Not only did they congratulate each other, they even tried to find some alcohol in the galley to celebrate. Finding none, they settled for drinking soda from the fridge instead. Even ground control found this whole sequence odd and quickly radioed them, asking if something was wrong given how fast the plane had climbed. Captain Jesse's answer was actually pretty candid. He said it was no big deal. They were flying an empty plane that night with no passengers, so they'd gone a bit higher just for fun. A reason that would get them fired today didn't seem all that outrageous in the flying world back then, because U.S. regional airlines were in a period of rapid expansion at the time. Airlines everywhere were expanding fast and scrambling for staff, and pilots were a scarce resource every company was fighting over. So even people with limited experience, like Jesse and Peter, were being hired by small regional carriers like Pinnacle Airlines. And to some people who lacked the composure and professionalism the job required, jets genuinely felt like a high-end, thrilling toy, so whenever they got the chance, they'd pull some reckless stunt just for fun. This had become something the industry had simply grown used to. But that day, while the excuse fooled ground control, it couldn't change the cold, hard laws of physics. After traveling a little further at that extreme altitude, the plane stalled. As the alarm sounded and the stall warning light on the panel flashed nonstop, the control column, under computer control, pushed all the way forward, putting the plane into a nose-down recovery attitude. This terrified Jesse and Peter. They thought the autopilot had malfunctioned, so they pulled the column back and desperately tried to keep the nose level. They had no idea that the plane automatically pitching down into that recovery attitude was actually what was saving their lives. It turned out both pilots had received stall recovery training before, but only for situations where the plane was at low or medium altitude. In those cases, you'd usually just need to lower the nose slightly to regain speed, then push the throttle forward for more thrust, and the problem would be solved. But above 12,000 meters, things were completely different. Because the air up there is much thinner, giving the plane far less lift while also cutting engine output dramatically. So pushing the throttle alone couldn't fix the stall. The only real solution was to pitch the nose steeply downward, trade altitude for speed using gravity, and after diving far enough to build up speed, level off again. Unfortunately, lacking that training and startled by what was happening, Jesse and Peter mistook this self-correcting maneuver for a malfunction and did the exact opposite. 3 times in a row, whenever the plane pitched down into a dive, they pulled the nose back up. In this string of badly botched moves, the plane bled off what little speed it had left, and the Bombardier CRJ-200 began falling like a kite with its string cut, dropping toward the ground nose up and tail down in an eerie posture. The aircraft's 2 engines, its lifeline, flamed out in the chaotic airflow, and the plane began plummeting like a giant hunk of metal. Of course, having made it to captain, Jesse wasn't a total novice at advanced maneuvers either. After falling for a stretch, the plane went from a straight drop into a glide. By then, ground control had also noticed on radar that something was off and called them again, asking why the plane's altitude had swung so wildly in such a short time. At this point, Jesse and Peter, though drenched in panic sweat, still tried to hide the truth and calmly claimed there was no major emergency. Just one of the 2 engines had failed and shut down, so they needed to descend. Because if they'd reported both engines dead, that would count as a major emergency in aviation. Ground control would immediately launch emergency protocols, guiding the plane to the nearest alternate airport while mobilizing ground crews, firefighters, and paramedics to stand by. At the time, at least 4 airports nearby met the requirements for an emergency landing, but a response on that scale would inevitably be followed by a full investigation, which would expose that the 2 of them had been messing around and caused the stall and the loss of altitude. At that point, losing their jobs would be the least of it. Worst case, the airline could hold them liable for damages, and that debt wouldn't be small. So they chose to keep hiding the crisis from ground control while frantically trying to restart the engines. Ground control also chose to believe their story, since a plane like the CRJ-200 can still fly normally on one engine. So after guiding them through a few wide turns, air traffic control let them continue on a new route toward their original destination. Relieved that they'd covered it up, the 2 of them didn't realize they'd just missed their one shot at guaranteeing survival despite how bad things already were. Because afterward, when this accident was reviewed, many crews brought in to reenact the scenario in a simulator, who reported the dual-engine failure right away, landed safely at an alternate airport with a 100% success rate. But even so, fate still left Jesse and Peter one last chance. And that was restarting the engines. After repeatedly pressing the start button with no luck, they scrambled to flip through the flight manual and finally found the procedure for this exact situation, which was to keep diving to bring the plane's speed up to 240 knots, roughly 445 km/h, using the oncoming rush of air to windmill the stalled engines back to life and reignite them. Similarly, in later simulations, 50% of crews successfully restarted their engines using this method. But knowing what to do is one thing, having the nerve to actually do it is another. For the two of them who had already lost a lot of altitude, diving once more to build up speed was basically a bet with their own lives. After much back and forth, they never managed to work up the courage for this last-ditch move, and instead slowed the plane to 180 knots to stretch out their glide time as long as possible. And it was in that hesitation that their last window slipped away again. Of course, at this point they still had one last hope, that once the plane dropped below 4,000 meters, the air would get denser and richer in oxygen, letting them activate a system called the APU, essentially a small air compressor whose airflow could be used to force the engines to try restarting. So did the engines actually restart as they'd hoped? All that can be said is that as the plane's altitude dropped to around 3,000 meters, they activated the APU and pressed the engine start button again. The two engines answered with a few mechanical roars. Peter couldn't help but cheer at that, but right after, the engines went silent again. It turned out that when the engines shut down at high altitude, their internal temperature had been very high. But because the two pilots had played it safe by keeping the plane's speed low the whole time, not enough airflow had passed through to cool them down. In contrast, the engine's outer casings had been in constant contact with the cold outside air, so their temperature dropped quickly. That gap between inside and outside temperature ended up causing the internal components to seize completely. At this point, the two pilots finally understood just how hopeless things were. Not only could the accident no longer be hidden, their own lives were now on the line too. High in the sky, they finally admitted to air traffic control over the radio that both engines had failed. On hearing this, ground control was understandably stunned and immediately guided them toward the nearest airport, Jefferson City Memorial Airport, to land. Unfortunately, after all the earlier hesitation and covering up, the plane had already dropped to a dangerously low altitude. Realizing they wouldn't make it to the airport no matter what they did, the two pilots made one last desperate attempt to land on a road. In the process, though, the plane clipped the tops of several large trees, then tumbled and crashed into a residential neighborhood. The aircraft broke apart instantly, and both pilots died on impact. Miraculously, while the backyards of a few homes were damaged, no houses were destroyed and no one on the ground was hurt. Afterward, through the black box recordings, investigators quickly determined the cause of the crash. A series of unauthorized maneuvers the two pilots carried out purely out of vanity and for fun. Once the news got out, Captain Jesse and First Officer Peter were voted by online users as recipients of the 2004 Darwin Award. Of course, the disaster did have some positive fallout. It pushed regional airlines to retrain pilots so they'd better understand high-altitude flight and how to respond to it. It also led airlines in their internal reviews to discover plenty of pilots had been pulling reckless, unauthorized stunts just for fun, so a stricter set of regulations and more sophisticated systems were rolled out afterward. Today, on almost every commercial flight, the flight recorder's operational data is automatically uploaded to the cloud after landing to be reviewed by a flight data analysis system. Sometimes even a single inappropriate push or pull on the controls by a pilot will immediately trigger an alert, a huge reduction in the odds of human error. But when anything gets taken to an extreme, new problems tend to show up. When engineers grow overconfident that they've built the perfect flight assist system and give it more authority than the captain. The next catastrophic disaster is already just around the corner. We'll save that story for another time. All right, that's it for today's episode. Thanks again so much for all your support and encouragement. See you in the next video.